Historians have an original sin. The greatest sin for us historians is anachronism. So we tend to project our present views onto the past. And how can you not do that? Because you live in the present. You think in the present. You have a mental framework through which you look. And you have no direct contact with the past. When I go to the archives, I ask for a dossier. The dossier arrives and I start reading, but I only have the paper with writing inscribed on it, and somehow from that I have to make history. So I'm looking at the past through a mirror, like Alice in Wonderland. No direct sight. There is, in other words, a danger of subjectivity, of prejudice, of a narrowing of vision all the time. And I think the best thing is to recognize that so that you are as unanachronistic as possible. In other words, self-consciousness about anachronism is, I believe, a help. But we will never have direct contact with the past, even in the present. We are having a conversation now, but you are interpreting what I say through your own mental framework. We are having a discussion in English, but you are maybe translating part of it into Portuguese and hearing things that perhaps I did not intend. So in this, it's a hermeneutic view of culture. I see, as I said, everything as an interpretive play. But that doesn't mean it can't be true. What needs to be done is to check your interpretation against the evidence. Fiction is part of history. What people write as fiction is an active force in their society. So as a historian, I don't simply study police actions when they arrest people, but I read the novels that were written. In fact, I've even discovered some novels that had disappeared into the past. One is called The Bohemians, and no one had ever heard of it. Only 2 or 3 copies survived. But it's a novel written by an unknown author. I know his name. It's the Marquis de Belleport. He wrote it in the Bastille. And he was in the Bastille for 4 years at the same time as the Marquis de Sade. So we have 2 marquises writing erotic novels at the same time. My Marquis, the Marquis de Belleport, had dropped out of French literature, but I think his book is very revealing about the conditions of authors, social relations, etc. So, of course, I read fiction from the 18th century every day because it tells me a great deal, but it requires interpretation. However, as I said earlier, everything is interpretation. So I feel that works of fiction are absolutely vital in the functioning of any social system. We have no immediate access to reality. Even language comes with a spin on it. And you might have a direct knowledge of the words I use, but the meaning of the words often is something quite different. Philosophers talk about speech acts, and they distinguish between the way meaning is made in enunciations and the ostensible meaning. So, of course, we live in a world of symbols, and we are always interpreting symbols, interpreting dress, how you are dressed, how you speak, how you use your eyes, what your body language is. We live in a world in which interpretation is an everyday affair. And of course, interpretation of human behavior can be similar to interpretation of a book in a novel. So I accept that we have no immediate access to reality, but we look through a screen of subjectivity, coming from our own minds, but also a screen that is created socially. We have a mental framework, what the French call a mentalité, that is social. So I'm probably looking to you like some kind of gringo Yankee who comes from another world. It's true, I do come from another world, but that doesn't mean we cannot make contact. And part of the pleasure of being here in Brazil is that I get to interpret a little bit what you are doing, and you get to interpret what I am doing. One thing that is especially difficult for historians to grasp is sound. We can't hear the past. It's mute. We know that sounds pervaded the world that existed 200, 300, 500 years ago, but we can't hear those sounds. I am especially interested in oral communication, along with communication by print. I, by chance, ran across a dossier in the archives. It's pure chance. You often find things you're not looking for, and that's when things get interesting. So I was sitting in the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal in Paris, going through dossiers, one after another, hundreds of dossiers, and one of them said, L'affaire des 14, the affair of the 14. What 14? I never heard of this affair. I opened the dossier, and it began with an order from Versailles, the top of the government, to the head of the police in Paris, find the author of the poem that begins with, and then they gave the first line of the poem, Monstre dans la noire furie, monster whose black fury. That's all the police knew. They had to find the author. It's a long story, but as I went through the dossier, it was like a detective story. The police had spies. They arrested one person. He was a law student, actually. And they said, where did you get this poem? A. He is A. I got it from B. B is arrested. I got it from C. C is arrested. I got it from D. And when D is arrested, he said, yes, I got it from E, but I got 3 more songs and poems from X, Y, and Z. And soon I was able to reconstruct an oral circuit of diffusion. All of it done by word of mouth and much of it by singing, because these poems were adapted to popular songs. But what were the popular songs in Paris around 1750? Well, I later had the texts of many of these songs, literally hundreds of them, and I learned that people improvise new words to old tunes every day. There were no real newspapers, so how did people know the news? By listening to songs. Paris was full of singing. I am now reading Ficciones by Borges, and one of his main themes is how dreams, fantasies penetrate into the real world of everyday life and can interact with reality or turn it upside down. So I respect authors who argue that there is no no real boundary line between fantasy and reality. The difficulty with that position, in my opinion, has to do with suffering. If anyone has truly suffered, tell them there's no difference between that suffering and what they read in a novel. And they will want to slap you in the face. Think of the experience of the Western world and, in fact, the Asian world in the 20th century. One world war after another, terrible suffering. Think of the suffering today. So I think that if I argue there's no real distinction between fiction and nonfiction if I were in the Congo or other places where the suffering is terrible. I would really be offensive to these people. So, of course, you can imagine a kind of gray zone where fiction dissolves into nonfiction. On the other hand, I think one must respect the suffering of others and not reduce the real world of hunger, of poverty, of ignorance to some fantasy of a novelist. I certainly feel that what Irving Goffman, a sociologist, calls the presentation of self in everyday life is a kind of acting. We are, in communicating, always acting. That doesn't mean we're hypocritical, but you can't not act. How can you say something that is absolutely clear, pure, uncontaminated by afterthoughts and bits of irony, rhetorical devices? We use language, and language itself, of course, is a cultural construct. So if I speak French, I think I'm almost another person. I use language in a different way as when I speak English. I wish I could speak Portuguese, and then we could try this out. So yes, I'm quite happy with the concept that we act all the time, but let's not abuse the concept and pretend that it's sheer hypocrisy and we are strutting on a stage. No, it's an everyday affair. I think we must take heed of the way states interfere with speech, with journalism, with television, with the internet, and with books. My own research concerns state interference with books, and I have spent a lot of time in the archives. My goal is not just to condemn censorship, which I hate, but to understand it. The problem is it can look so simple, the struggle of repression against liberty. Well, that's correct. However, if you get inside it, it's much more complicated. So I feel my challenge as a historian is to get inside the mechanism of censorship, to understand how it worked, and even to understand how the censors themselves thought. So I began in 18th century France, which is my specialty as an historian, and I read hundreds and hundreds of letters from one censor to another talking about their jobs. I also read the archives of the police when they broke into bookstores or seized authors and put them in the Bastille. There was severe repression, but it was more complicated than that, and the censors thought, as one of them said, "Je défends l'honneur de la littérature française." I am defending the honor of French literature. They thought it was positive. The censors had to give what were called approbations so that a book would receive a privilege. A privilege was kind of like a copyright. So any legal book had to pass through the censorship in order to be published. But a privilege, it's not like getting a copyright today. It's a royal stamp of approval that actually concerns the quality of the book. If we jump now from 18th century France into 20th century communist East Germany, I was there when the wall fell in 1989. I actually met some censors. The meeting was arranged with mutual friends who were East German authors, and I had a conversation with them. I said, "What is your job? How do you do it? How do you understand it?" etc. And one of them, his name was Hans-Jürgen Wesener, answered in one word: planning. Censorship is planning. Literature should be planned like anything in a socialist country. And then he reached into a drawer of his desk and pulled out the plan for East German literature in the year 1990. It was a year that never happened because the Berlin Wall fell. But he gave me the plan. I studied it. And then I went into the archives of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and studied the archives over 5 years. And soon I understood, I think, what the censors meant by censorship. Literature should be engineered like everything in a socialist system. And they thought this was positive. They believed in it. They were not simply hacks who were trying to repress liberty. But of course, they did repress liberty. And East Germany had a kind of gulag where authors were sent. The repression varied over time. It was much worse right after World War II. But by the time I arrived in Germany, the Stasi were everywhere, the secret police. In fact, I discovered I had my own dossier in the secret police of the East Germans. So the idea is to not simply condemn censorship, but to understand it. I'm not a great believer in definitions. I know we should be clear, so I'm in favor of clearness, but definitions have a mechanical effect. They seem to freeze something and to reify it. So I can't pull a definition of fiction out of my pocket, but I think it's fair to contrast nonfiction with fiction. Mm-hmm. Now, the word fiction means to fabricate, to make. And it's quite true that in writing history, I make things. I sometimes think of myself as an artisan, someone who might make shoes. I make books, but the books have a reference to what I honestly feel is the truth. That is to say, I go into the archives, I do research with manuscripts, mm-hmm. and I feel I get in contact with other lives lived 200, 300 years ago. Mm-hmm. Now, the contact is not perfect. I can't talk with them, but I can listen to the traces of their voices. And so, although I'm making history in the sense of creating something, I'm also relating it to lives that really were lived. Now, if I were writing fiction, I could just make it up, and there is no rigor in proof. So this may sound like British empiricism. I did my graduate work at Oxford. I went to Harvard before that. British empiricism means respecting the evidence. And so I think in the world of nonfiction, we respect proof, documentation, rigor. And yet we understand that we are creating something that has some subjective elements and that could be wrong. We could get it wrong, but we're trying to get it right.